Now let's move on to prediction sampling and statistical analysis. I'm going to introduce you to a term called regression analysis equation. It's a statistical test to determine whether or not one variable can affect change in another. So we're talking about prediction. And sociologists oftentimes study human behavior within a social context to find out if we can predict whether or not social problems will take place and how to correct some of those issues. So, predicting patterns of social interaction is the goal of sociology. Usually in class, I'll tell my students, it's important that you take good notes. Ask questions whenever something confuses you. Read the chapters. Not everything in the chapter, but if I covered it in class and it's in the book, then you need to read it. Now, why am I giving you that kind of advice? Because I want to prevent you from doing what? Failing. Because I can predict that about a third of my students will fail the first exam because in the 14 years I've been teaching, I've noticed that some students engage in certain patterns of behavior that lead to failure. So I'm trying to prevent that. And the way we're able to prevent something is because we can predict something because we tend to focus on patterns of human behavior. Second point, concepts. If we're going to study a concept, it has to first be converted into a variable. And what is a variable? A variable is social phenomena that can be measured. Now, let me give you an example. I'm going to take my master's thesis to illustrate what a regression analysis equation is because I conducted a regression analysis as a way to measure whether or not two variables were connected. And my area of interest in my master's program in sociology is the same as it is for my PhD studies. And that is violence against women. That's something that I've always been interested in. So let's say I'm interested in the improving status of women. But let me make this more specific. The improving economic status of women. Now, maybe I'm interested in finding out whether or not we can predict lethal partner homicides. Well, lethal and homicides means the same thing. So let me change this to intimate partner homicides. So the victim and the offender are in an intimate relationship. Now, I want to predict whether or not intimate partner homicides will change based on women's economic status beginning to rise. This is a concept, meaning it's broad, it's general, and it's somewhat vague. Now, I can go to the FBI crime statistics and I can find information on intimate partner homicides because there's a way to query the data of homicides based on the relationship of the victim to the offender. So I can go into the FBI crime statistics and find out the number of women that have been murdered by male partners. But this is something that is not a variable. This is because I can measure that. But this, the improving economic status of women is too broad. It's too vague. So I need to break this down into variables that can be measured so I can gauge whether or not women's economic status has continued to rise in our society. So I'm going to look at a couple of factors. I'm going to look at the number of women, and I'm going to use this symbol, in college. I'm also, let me adjust this here, I'm also going to look at the number of women in male-dominated jobs. The number of women in male-dominated professional occupations. So I looked at the number of women in architecture, law, medicine, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Those are the most high-paying jobs in our country. But these are also jobs that are dominated by men. And I also looked at the number of women in skilled trades dominated by men. So construction trades, mechanics, plumbing, electrical services. Believe it or not, women are entering those fields. And the time frame for my study was 1980 through 1995. So I had to look for data and the census statistics in these areas. Now, if I'm going to measure the improving economic status of women, I need to do that by looking at the number of women in college, the number of women in professional occupations dominated by men, and also the number of women in skilled trades dominated by men. So that's the way I gauge women's improving economic status. Now, the next point. Regression analysis it is a statistical quantitative approach to determine if there's a predictive relationship between two variables. So I'm trying to find out if we can predict the number of intimate partner homicides based on the economic status or the rising economic status of women. So it's to find out if there's a predictive correlation between two variables. Again, I have to check my notes to make sure I'm covering the points. But the first thing you have to do is you have to determine which will be your independent versus your dependent variable. Now, the dependent variable is the variable that's going to change based on a change in the other variable, the independent variable. So this is the variable I'm trying to measure, and that would be here. This would be my dependent variable. Now, according to your notes, the dependent variable is the variable that is to be explained or predicted. So I'm trying to predict a change in intimate partner homicides or the rate of women killed by male partners based on the improving economic status of women. Therefore, this would be my independent variable. This variable, my independent variable, is going to impact this one. So I had to identify which would be my dependent versus my independent variable. Now, before you begin your research, you have to first come up with a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a scientific guess to predict how the independent and dependent variables are related. So for my master's thesis, this was my hypothesis. I predicted that as women's economic status continued to rise, male power would be threatened. And as a result of male power being diminished, we would see an increase in the number of intimate partner homicides. So this is a deductive theory, a deductive study. I'm starting with a theory, and I set up a study to test my hypothesis. And now we'll move on to something very important. That's called the correlation coefficient. That will be on the next slide.